program, also known as the bank bailout, $700 billion to bail out the banks. So the same amount of money that we spent in the bank bailout is being spent every single year around the globe to subsidize fossil fuels. So every single year we are bailing out the fossil fuel industry. It's an interesting thought. So to conclude, the Industrial Revolution brought the developed world 150 years of unprecedented prosperity, a free lunch of historic proportions. And by and large, that prosperity has been a good thing for those of us who have partaken of it. But what we have learned now, what we have learned from scientific work, is that that lunch was not actually free. Global warming is the bill, and it is a bill that has now come due. And as the writer Kim Stanley Robinson has pointed out, the invisible hand never picks up the check. Thank you very much. You're about to go on a vacation with your wife and children. Well, I'll say wife because you're a man, but your family. And 97 of the mechanics who have inspected the plane tell you that it is not safe to fly on. But 3 mechanics hired by the airplane company, not Boeing, of course, but 3 mechanics tell you it's perfectly fine. What are you going to do? So, maybe making it a little more immediate, making it a little bit more obvious, like what we're really talking about. I don't know. In my own experience, it's very hard to say. Different people are different, and I found that, it helps to ask the other person some questions about where they're coming from and why they are skeptical about it in order to begin to get at what particularly is bothering them, because it's different for different people. And I think what you can argue is different depending on who you are. So for me personally, when I've given this talk in places where it's not just preaching to the choir, one of the things I do is I sometimes spend more time on the science and go into more detail about the evolution and the growth of the scientific knowledge, and also what the specific data were that behind that consensus. And I have often found that people come up to me afterwards and say, wow, I had no idea the science was so old. And it's very interesting that for a lot of people that is helpful because they've heard that it's just the latest environmental fad, or they've heard it's a liberal conspiracy. But then they see this and they realize, well, first of all, it's not a fad. We've been studying this for 100 years. If it's a liberal conspiracy, it started in Ireland in the 1850s, right? So, knowing the history, I find, at least for some people, has been helpful for giving it a slightly different slant.
Thank you so much.
You're
Have
welcome.
you changed any minds?
I think so. Yeah, I've gotten some email from people who have said that, that they've adjusted a little bit. So, bit by bit, petit à petit, l'oiseau fait son nid, go ahead.
So, my question is, how much of a rhetorical handicap are ethical scientists laboring under? Because I was noticing in the quotes that you had from the scientists behaving ethically, they properly hedge their statements, saying there's a probability that seems very likely that...
Most of the warming, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, because they're not actually arguing from data and from analysis, they don't seem to have, they don't put those hedge words in there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's not even much more I can add to that. You're absolutely right. It's been a huge handicap for the scientific community because scientists are trying to be honest about the uncertainties, about the probabilities, and it does handicap them. So the scientific community, one thing I think our book has helped, I think it's actually helped scientists to rethink some of their communication strategies. And I've been invited to a few workshops over the last year by scientists who are grappling with this issue and trying to come up with some more effective ways to communicate that are still honest and ethical, but maybe are a little bit more efficacious in reaching ordinary people. So I'm hopeful that we'll see some positive changes, but it is a really big challenge.
I'm going to go back to that moment where, the link between the sort of Roosevelt, Rockefeller, Pinchot republicanism, and when it switches. So, I'm just trying to figure out, what makes... part of it is all of a sudden you're saying the crises emerge and you actually have to do something about them. So you could be more abstract earlier. But what is it in our culture, especially recently, that suddenly makes us more vulnerable to lies than maybe we were earlier on?
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
Or was there all along in our culture, maybe?
Yeah, I don't know that it's so sudden. I think part of what we see in the story, and if you read the book, one of the things you'll see is that part of what we do for every case is we go back and we start with, well, how did scientists get involved in this issue in the first place? And in every case, one of the things that we learned, I mean, we didn't know the science was so old. In every case, we discovered the science was older than we had thought, because there's often a long history of research before scientists get to the point where they would say, yes, this is definitely happening. So, so it is sort of bad luck, I think, that some of these issues really did kind of coalesce in the late 70s and 80s when Ronald Reagan comes to power, pushing this very, very strong political agenda of less government, less regulation, unleashing the magic of the marketplace, all of those things. So there really is a clash. And many of us are familiar with, some of the clashes that took place in the Republican...
They're also going after the whole 40 years of consensus domestically.
Right, so they're sort of trying to break that up. And then there is also a shift in the U.S. environmental movement, and we talk about this again in the book. I mean, a lot of the early environmentalism up until the 1970s was really about land preservation. It was a conservationist model, the Gifford-Pinchot model, that was actually in some ways very pro-business, right? I mean, the Gifford-Pinchot model is about, land of many use, wise use, all that stuff. So it was quite sympathetic to forestry, forest companies. And so, which is not to say that the forest industry loved Gifford-Pinchot, because they absolutely did not. If anybody's read the book The Big Burn by Timothy Egan, you know that. But still, it wasn't really viewed as anti-business by and large, although it was by some people. But also, it was a kind of patrician environmentalism, right? I mean, Gifford-Pinchot, was at Yale, came from this very wealthy, aristocratic kind of family, obviously the Roosevelts. So it wasn't a grassroots movement. It wasn't associated with left-wing politics. That really did change in the 60s and 70s when a different kind of environmentalism emerged around pollution issues, which were about business polluting the environment, did, in many cases, have a kind of, not necessarily anti-business per se, but a critical approach towards what businesses were doing in terms of polluting the air, the water, destroying landscapes and stuff. So the tenor of the environmental movement did change and did become more left-wing, more grassroots, in some ways much more democratic, but in ways that also generated a lot of anger and hostility and backlash in some sectors of the business community. So, we go into this in more detail in the book. It's a complicated issue, but I don't think it's that sudden. I think it really builds up over, 20 or 30 years. Yeah.
Thank you. I spent most of my career in public health, much of it and over the last couple of decades in tobacco prevention and control, so parts of this story are very familiar to me. My question is that I think, as we're all aware, there are many, many scientific issues that impact our lives where there's a relatively clear consensus, but for which there's a small group of people that disagree. In many cases, that small minority don't achieve a highly visible platform to influence the rest of us and shift the opinion of large groups of people. And I know you said the how is in the book, but I wonder if you could share a little bit,
sure,
just a little bit more, maybe a little teaser about why it is that this particular group of folks obtained the leverage and the voice that they did in order to shift public opinion.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. Of course, we do discuss this in the book, and I hope people will read the book and read more about it. So I'll just give you a little bit. There's really three things. So in the beginning of the story, one thing that it really is crucial is the Cold War. These men were deeply influential because of what they had done in the Cold War. And in some ways, it actually goes back to the atomic bomb. I mean, the atomic bomb really thrust into positions of unprecedented influence a group of very brilliant men, but who I think also became kind of narcissistic and even egomaniacal, perhaps, because of what they had done in building the atomic bomb. And so they had the ear of the president, congressmen, senators, admirals, generals, and they used it. And so they had access to power. And so when they began to become involved in these other issues, they could pick up the phone and get invited to the White House. And we talk in the book, we talk about one episode where Bill Nierenberg goes to the first Bush administration and presents this contrarian view of climate science. He's completely out of the mainstream. He's done no research on climate science. He's taking positions that no climate scientist in America would agree with, but yet he's the one who's getting invited to the White House, not the actual climate scientist. So that's one part of it. Second part of it, of course, is that then they begin to make common cause with the fossil fuel industry. And that happens a little later, and so as the story unfolds, in the 1990s, we begin to see the fossil fuel industry seeing what these guys are doing and thinking, oh, that's kind of good, that works for us. And so we see the fossil fuel industries beginning to pump money into these think tanks the Marshall Institute, the Cato Institute, American Enterprise, Competitive Enterprise, Heartland, Heritage, those are kind of the big ones. So money is, of course, part of the story. Money comes into it, but not in the sense of these individuals doing it for money, but rather in a kind of confluence of money and ideology that then makes this extremely powerful. And then the third part of it, I think, has to do with the media landscape and also the rise of the internet. Because now, today, if you go on the internet, you see these really preposterous claims being repeated over and over and over again. And many times they use language that someone like me or Eric Conway, who has studied this, we recognize this as language that has come from the Cato Institute or come from the Heartland Institute or even come from the tobacco industry. But now it gets picked up and it gets repeated over and over again. Sometimes I do radio call-ins like I did this morning, and I can hear people saying things that I know what website they've got it off of, you know? And that wouldn't have happened 30 or 40 years ago. So now we are in this much more challenging media landscape that makes it much, much more difficult to refute these kinds of claims once they get out into the common vernacular.
You talk a lot about the Cold War being an influence on these people's thoughts, and do you see the scientists of, you know, the 30 and younger being proponents of these theories? Or because, I mean, I grew up with Captain Planet and that kind of idea, and our generation is different. We don't have the big boogeyman looming over us, and so the idea of, you know, socialists under the environmental, you know, crust is not, it's foreign. And that's what I was wondering about. Do you see it continuing past the current generation of the Cold War scientists?
Well, one thing is there aren't very many of these people under 30. They tend to be older. But it's really interesting is how they've managed to keep this specter of communism alive. So even among people who are younger, people who are, you know, too young to really have grown up in a significant way during the, say, the coldest parts of the Cold War, they still raise this issue, you know. So think about, like, during the healthcare debate, people talk, you know, Pat Michaels, who's a famous climate skeptic denier, whatever you want to call him, called it Obamunism, you know? I mean, what is that about, right? And the whole healthcare debate, right? We got all these things about it being socialistic and stuff. So they managed to keep this argument alive. And recently I saw something, Glenn Beck is quoting Friedrich von Hayek, you know? So it's kind of amazing how you can take a political argument, a political debate from the past that should be dead, that should be irrelevant, and still use it to stir up old anxieties and maintain old divisions, and that is continuing to be done in the right wing in the United States right now.